Let's talk about hand protection on percussive weapons such as axes and warhammers. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So a question that comes up underneath a fair number of my videos actually over the last few years is why didn't weapons such as hammers and axes and maces and things like this, why didn't they develop hand protection? Well, famously we know that swords did develop hand protection. As early as the 15th century, swords started to develop, shall we call them, complex guards. Okay, so in HEMA this is a term that we usually use. A complex hilt is something that protects your hand. And the question is, why don't things like warhammers and maces and axes develop these? Well, let's go back a step, okay? Let's just consider swords. So in the first step, actually, if we go back to the Viking era, so here's a Viking era sword made by Albion, it's the Albion Clontarf, and they actually don't have very much hand protection. If I was to use this sword by itself, I'd have to be very wary of things coming in towards my hand, because anything that comes in there, you can see it has a little guard. Okay, so it does have a little bit of a guard, so anything sliding down the blade will hopefully get stopped on that, but there's really not very much. And if I'm in the process of slashing at someone, they can step out of the way of that slash and target my incoming hand or wrist fairly easily, because there's not very much in the way there to protect it. Now, why didn't Viking era swords have better hand protection on them? Well, quite simply, it's because in the Viking era, they were predominantly using these things. Okay, so here we've got a shield, a boss grip shield in this case. Obviously later on, they were using predominantly strapped shields. But with a boss grip shield, if I'm cutting at an opponent, a lot of the time my hand, can you see there? You can't really see, you can see my hand where it starts maybe, but where it terminates, you can't really get to it. Now, assuming the other person's right-handed, their blow is going to be predominantly coming from that side, i.e. the shield side, and therefore the shield is between their blow and my hand or arm. And that's one of the things that we find in sword and buckler fencing later on, in later periods, in the 14th and 6th to 16th centuries. That's one of the things that we find protects the hand in sword and buckler. So for that reason, sword and buckler, sword and shield is actually really good at protecting the wielder's sword arms. It means I can more or less freely use my weapon without giving too many lines away, without giving too many direct targets to my hand. And now you've got to bear in mind, in the Viking era, unlike as we might see with reenactors today, if you look at Battle of the Nations or any of the sort of big Viking era battles that are reenacted, you'll see that Viking reenactors in that period, Anglo-Saxon and Frankish and Longobards reenactors predominantly now wear hand protection, and that's for health and safety reasons. They don't want to get their finger smashed, understandably. But curiously, or perhaps not, in the actual Viking era, in the so-called Dark Ages, they didn't wear hand protection. As far as we can tell, there may be a couple of isolated pictures of people wearing gloves in this period, but almost universally, when we see people using sword and shield or spear and shield, whatever, axe and shield, in art of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, we don't see them wearing anything on their hand at all. If you look at the Battle of Hastings, as shown in the Bayeux Tapestry, for example, you can see that many soldiers have mail shirts and helmets, but they don't have anything on their hands at all. Now, why don't they? Well, again, I'd come back to this thing of the fact that, first of all, they probably had slightly tougher hands, they're a slightly more manual period. So if you're going to compare hands with people of that period, you probably want to compare with a labourer today, someone who's got very rough hands that are used to being knocked about. However, of course, you can't have hands rough enough to prevent from a weapon injury, but it does seem that for whatever reason they just didn't think that their hands were very much at risk. Now, I put this down to two things. Number one is the shield, as I've mentioned. If you're using a shield, and they were pretty much always using shields in the left hand at the same time as using whatever weapon they were using their right hand, if you're using a shield, that blocks off the line to the hand, as I've shown. But there is a secondary reason, and that is, as far as we can tell, in early fencing, there was less use of what we shall term feints. That is, most attacks in the earlier treatises, for example, if we look at 15th century fencing treatises, most of the attacks are direct. They are direct attacks. So if they say give a cut to the head, they just give a cut to the head. If that fails, then you might go somewhere else. But we don't see very much kind of feinting in order to hit somewhere else in the early treatises. That's not to say they didn't do it, because I think it's absolutely human nature to do it. But it does seem that the earlier treatises have less of that kind of thing. They have less small and less subtle, I'll get some flaming for this, movements, but we see larger, simpler movements a lot in the earlier treatises. But in addition to that, you have to put it into a battlefield context if we're really talking about weapons like this. Yes, these were used for duels. Famously, the Vikings duelled with up to 5 shields they could expend in a Viking duel. But generally speaking, if these weapons were being used in war, there is less feinting and less fake attacks used if you're just going to hit someone and get out. Swing at someone, might succeed, might not, they might block it, go on to the next opponent or defend yourself from the next opponent. There's less kind of fencing, as most people would think of it, than you would get in a one-on-one match. So in an actual kind of battlefield situation, it's mostly going to be, block this, bam, hit that person, block this, hit that person, bam. It's going to be big, simple, gross motor movements. And in this situation, hands are less likely to be deliberately targeted, because people have a tendency, we even see this in knife fighting, I'll talk about this in a second, people have a tendency under stress in a battlefield situation to aim for killing blows or disabling blows to the head, to the body, to the big parts, to the main targets. They tend not to be aiming to disable or snipe at things which might not even stop the attack from coming in anyway. Just to talk about knives, as I just promised, we do find this kind of comparable example if we look at knife fighting. And if we look at knife fighting, if you give 2 people simulated knives and tell them to spar, then they'll do something that looks a little bit like fencing, and they'll target each other's hands. However, if you give them the same knife simulators and tell them that they have 5 seconds to kill the other person, it will look entirely different. You just change the context as simply as that. And this is just within a classroom sparring environment. If you just change the context or the rules, as it were, or the aim of the game just a little bit, you'll see that it very quickly changes the way that they fight. We even see this in HEMA sparring. If you change the rules of a tournament, you can get very different looking fighting, like extremely different looking fighting. And I have known some people, some quite respected people in HEMA, who say, oh, it's not the rules in a HEMA competition that dictate the type of fighting, it's the training of the fighters. I see what they're saying, but I disagree. I have been running tournaments for like nearly 20 years now at various events, and in my own club. And absolutely, if you change the rules, people fence differently. People try and win within the set of rules. They fit the rules. If you create a box, they fill that box. So coming back to the original topic, so we've looked at why you don't really need a big guard if you're using a shield. But then, if that's the case, why do we start to see longer guards? So this is a replica of a 15th century sword, as found in Westminster Abbey. I won't call it Henry V's sword, because it's probably not Henry V's sword. But we start to see longer guards come in on later period swords. Why might that be? Well, it would be easy for us to say because shields were used less. However, long guards, like on the St Maurice replica on the wall, start to come about actually while shields are still very, very common. And this is one of the great questions of sword development. Why did long guards come around in the 11th century when they hadn't really existed, except for a few isolated examples, in the 10th century? Why did that come about? Well, partly it might be to do with cavalry warfare. That's a standard answer you'll find historians often give. Does that make any sense? Do you inherently need a longer guard with a cavalry sword? Well, the Mongols definitely didn't think so. They had a little disc guard. Lots of other cultures around the world that were very successful on horses did not have long guards on their swords. The Japanese didn't, the Chinese didn't, basically all of Asia didn't. We could say possibly in Africa some parts did, but that may have been European influence. We don't know. Why did long guards come about? Well, certainly a long guard offers better protection to the hand. There's no question about it, okay? If you're cutting at someone and they try and target your hand, having that steel bar in there is advantageous from a direct attack. However, it doesn't make that much difference. It's not like having a knuckle bow as on a, let's move the Warhammer out of the way, as on a sabre. So you'll see that a sabre has a form of knuckle bow that protects the front of the hand. A medieval crossguard does not do that. If you're cutting at someone here, they can target the inside, outside or front of your hand as it comes in. It actually seems to be that this crossguard is more to do with binding with other blades. So to me, the reason that longer guards start to come about is probably to do with blade contact. The way that they were using the swords was more often sort of from the 11th century onwards, using the sword to sometimes block with. And if you're sometimes blocking with the sword, whether you have a shield or not, then having a crossguard becomes very advantageous, because the first thing that happens when you block a sword, or not the first thing, but what often happens is the blade will skip down towards your hand. So if you've got a large guard underneath, then that prevents it from skipping onto your arm or your fingers or anything else. And notice many types of European sword guard are curved like this with little hook bits to stop anything that slides down here escaping off the end. I think that's worth noting. So now coming back to the original question of why do hammers, axes and maces not have any form of hand protection? Well, I think I've just answered the question. I think it's largely because, for the most part, with some rare exceptions, they are not used for parrying. Swords are used for parrying because they're nimble. A big difference between a sword and a axe or a warhammer is that the sword is weighted, is balanced down at the back end. It's balanced down here. Okay, the hammer or axe is balanced at the top end. It's almost like they're upside down. So if you turn them that way around, they've now got similar points of balance. This way around, they're almost opposite. So by and large, these weapons which are top heavy, they are fantastic at converting an awful lot of potential energy into kinetic energy at the target. They're that's why they're called percussive weapons, because they hit with percussion. Okay, they hit with force, a lot of energy at the tip, but they are not nimble. That's not to say they're cumbersome or slow. You can still move them around pretty quickly, but you have to move them in a way that's a little bit different to a sword. So you have to use their momentum to steer them around to the next target. Not saying you don't do that with a sword, but you can't change the direction of a top heavy weapon as easily as you can with a back weighted weapon. And that's also not to say that absolutely they were never used to block with. Even if we're using a shield, yes, occasionally there might be situations where if someone strikes you from this side, you put the weapon in the way. It might be sometimes you double up the two things as well. If you don't have a shield, it may be that occasionally you essentially half sword or block with the thing like it's a stick. We get implication of this in some later treatises. And of course that makes it like a little pole arm as well. And we know that pole axes and halberds and things like this were used two-handed. So absolutely you can block with these. I'm not saying that you don't. I'm just saying that predominantly I suspect people didn't. Predominantly, I think if people were using a mace or a warhammer or an axe, they were hitting with it as hard as possible. You can't double up hits as quickly as you can with a sword, but when the hit lands, it has more effect, certainly on an armoured target, than a sword does. So that's my explanation. Now, that's not to say that it's an all-encompassing explanation. In fact, we do know that some types of, shall we call them, percussive weapons did have hand protection, and most famously so in Indo-Persia. And in Indo-Persian arms and armour, we do find maces, axes, warhammers, these types of things, sometimes with a sword hilt. Okay, we do sometimes find them with enclosed sword hilts. However, in Europe, by and large, we sometimes find warhammers, sometimes axes, sometimes maces with forms of small hand protection, but they very rarely have anything like a crossguard. I only know of one exception, and that's in the British Museum, which is a two-handed Warhammer that does indeed have a sword hilt with a crossguard. But they're very, very rare. I think the majority, you know, if the basic answer to the question of just trying to get this sword out, there you go. I think the basic answer of why did 15th century swords have a long crossguard and 15th century Warhammers for the most part did not, the answer is really about encountering other people's weapons. And for the most part, the sword might encounter someone else's weapon with the blade, whereas it's relatively unusual, I think, for something like a Warhammer or an axe to deliberately encounter someone else's blade or weapon. There is one final aspect which I know some of you will be going, Matt, what about this? And it is to do with gauntlets. Okay, quite simply, swords were carried in civilian life. They were carried in civilian life and therefore used with bare hands, just like I'm holding it now. So if I'm walking around town and someone attacks me, I pull my sword out and I'll be fighting with it with a bare hand. These axes and warhammers are weapons of war, and if you're the type of person that's taking one of these to war, you're most likely going to have some form of hand protection. So therefore you could say, because this is only a weapon, by and large, only a weapon that you're going to take to war, you're going to be clothed and equipped for war, whereas a sword, and that's undoubtedly why we start to see the earliest hand protection or complex handguards on swords which are civilian associated. Undoubtedly that's the reason why. And if we look at the 16th, 17th century, we see that sometimes war swords sometimes still have simple crossguards or just one side ring, like Sir Francis Drake's sword, for example, just has a knuckle bow and a side ring. And yet at the same time, if we look at certain other civilian wear swords, we find really complex swept hilts and Pappenheimers and cup hilts and things like this. So there we go, folks. I hope that illuminates the topic somewhat. And it's always good to talk more about Warhammers. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.